Good day. Welcome to Western Hills Bible Church. Book of Esther today, 7 and 8. Last week, chapter 5 went into Esther's banquet, and we learned of Haman's plot against Mordecai. Then in chapter 6, the king honors Mordecai, and then this week in chapter 7, Haman is exposed and hanged on the gallows instead of Mordecai. And then we're going to finish up with chapter 8, where Esther, in effect, saves the Jews. With that, let's get into our study. Esther chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done." So here's the setting. Recall that Esther had sent out a second banquet request to the king and Haman to join her. So here it is, day 2, and the king and Haman went to dine with Esther at her request. At her first banquet, Esther asked them back to the second banquet at which she would tell the king her request. So here we are. And we see here the king seems a bit anxious here. There isn't any mention about a welcoming drink or anything. The king gets right to the point. He wants to know what Esther wants. Verse 3. Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request." So Queen Esther, she no longer withheld her request from the king. She says to the king, "If I have found favor with you, and if it pleases your majesty," you see she's using a little bit of wisdom and tact here. She says, "Listen to my request on behalf of me and my people." Now, I have to think here that the king must have looked at her in stunned silence as she asked for her life and the lives of her people. He was probably thinking that she was going to be asking for some monetary possession or something like that, and it probably took the king some time to grasp the fact that she was identifying herself as a Jew. And it seems like Queen Esther, she got right to the point here. She says, "Let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request." Now, this seems a bit strange to me at this point in time, because the true Israel people, they've already been freed. We know in the book of Daniel, he was a true Israelite, one of the wisest of all, and actually over the children of Israel, as well as the children of this kingdom. So why is this request of some great danger made? Again, this is one of the difficulties I have with this book of Esther. There's no record of any history or even in God's Word, aside from this book of Esther, these events. But with that, let's get into verse 4. "For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." Without waiting for the king to speak, Esther went on to explain that she and her people had been sold for slaughter and destruction. And she added here that if it had been a matter of selling them as slaves rather than killing them, she may not have the heartache. For people were sold, at least the king would benefit from it monetarily. Verse 5. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to the queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" The king's reaction was immediate and furious. He demanded to know who dared to do such a thing. Now the king must have felt that the plot to kill the Jews was also an attack on his wife, because it was, in effect. And the king took this as a personal matter, a personal attack. And I have to think that the king may have thought about the matter with Haman and felt he had been duped. After all, Haman did not mention the Jews by name, so possibly the king was unaware of the full disclosure that he had signed. Verse 6. And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. It didn't take long for Esther to point out Haman as the enemy. Oh, Haman, he knew he was in trouble. He had to know that his fate was automatically sealed by Esther's words. Verse 7. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw the evil was determined against him by the king. The king was so angry, he just got up and walked out. And I have to think about, what was the king wondering in the garden there? He's probably thinking, how could he condemn Haman for carrying out the very orders that bore his royal seal? Haman, on the other hand, had to know that his fate was sealed. And Haman, he stayed back and pleaded for his life with the queen there. Verse 8. And when the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house? As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Oh, Haman's timing couldn't have been worse. Um, just as he fell on the couch where Esther was, reclining to plead for his life, the king walked in. And you can tell the king's angry words. He says there, will he, Haman, assault the queen? Those words, they were a sentence of death for Haman. Now, why did they cover Haman's face? We're not sure. There's no evidence that this was a Persian custom to cover the face of a condemned criminal before he was led away to execution. Maybe they were just trying to shroud him from Esther. We don't know. Verse 9. Now Harbonah, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him on it. One of the king's eunuchs, Harbonah, remembered the gallows that Haman had erected for the execution of Mordecai. Now, if the king had been considering mercy for Haman, Harbonah reminded the king that Haman had plotted the death of the man who had saved the king's life, talking about Mordecai. And this sealed the deal for Haman. The king said, hang him on it. Verse 10. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath was subsided. So Haman, he lost his very life on the gallows which he had anticipated would bring him such joy at Mordecai's execution. All right, verse 8. We'll get into this one, where Esther saves the Jews. Verse 1 reads, on that day King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king. for Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. It says on that day, this was the same day that Haman was executed. King Xerxes, or Cyrus, he gave Haman's entire estate to Esther, and this was probably done as compensation for all that she had suffered. And then Esther had she told the king how he was related to her, and so Esther revealed her true identity. And then the king invited him, Mordecai, into his presence, and the king gave his signet ring that he had reclaimed from Haman, and he gave it to him, gave it to Mordecai. This in effect makes Mordecai the prime minister. In other words, Mordecai had the power to act in the king's name. And Mordecai also became in charge over Haman's estate. So all that belonged to Haman now belonged to Mordecai, verse 3. Okay, now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the scheme that he had devised against the Jews. With great show of emotion, Esther fell at the feet of the king and begged him to put an end to the plan devised by Haman against the Jews. Verse 4. And the king held out his golden scepter towards Esther, so Esther rose and stood before the king. After Esther's plea, the king held out the golden scepter towards her. This could have been done to encourage Esther to rise from the prostrate position before they continued to speak. Verse 5, and said, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are all in the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people, or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? Esther, she's using some keen wisdom here, and she's using proper respect to the king, with hope that she won the king's favor. She petitioned the king to issue an order overruling Haman's letter. She reminded the king of Haman's orders that had been sent with explicit purpose of destroying the Jews. Esther, she's telling the king that she would be unable to endure seeing the pending destruction that's forthcoming to her people here. So she's using some wisdom here, some common sense, and she also is careful to place the blame on Haman and not the king. Verse 7. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name. Seal it with the king's signet ring, for whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. So how did the king respond to Esther? Well, he first reminded her. Um, he reminded her that he had given the estate of Haman to her. And then secondly, the king instructs Esther and Mordecai to write another decree in his name on his behalf of the Jews. In other words, he's wanting them to write a decree. The king, he would not be able to revoke his previous edict, so he had to write another edict, or I should say an edict had to be written that would neutralize the previous edict that was sent out. Verse 9. So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it's written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces from India to Ethiopia. 127 provinces in all, to every province in its own script, to every people in their own language, and the Jews in their behalf, and the Jews in their own script and language. So here, the royal secretaries, they were summoned at once. The scribes were commanded to write out the new edict in the languages of all the people. And we're talking probably 70 different districts, dialects, 70 different dialects, and distributed throughout the entire empire. This would ensure that no one could plead ignorance to Mordecai's orders. Verse 10. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses bred from swift steeds. Because of the authority granted to him by Xerxes, Mordecai wrote the orders in the king's name and then sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring. These orders, they were sent throughout the empire by mounted couriers on swift steeds. In other words, fast horses. And in other words, these were fast horses, and they were used to carry the king's message throughout the empire without delay. Verse 11, by these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together to protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. On one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So these two verses, they contain the contents of Mordecai's edict, which was distributed in the king's name. It pretty much granted the Jews the right to protect themselves against anyone who might attack them. It gave the Jews the right to slaughter women and children and plunder their property, plunder the property of their enemies. And this edict took effect on the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, almost a paraphrase of Haman's edict. This is another verse that I have a little issue with it, because it seems odd that the king would allow a minority group to massacre his subjects at will. In any event, it was the only way to neutralize the preceding event. Verse 13. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. Mordecai's edict was to be issued as law in every province of the empire and made known to all the subjects regardless of their nationality. Everyone would be on notice that the Jews would be ready on that designated day to take vengeance on their enemies. Verse 14, the couriers rode on royal horses, went out, hastened and pressed by the king's command, and a decree was issued in Shushan, the citadel. So riding the royal horses, the couriers acted quickly to deliver the edict to all parts of the kingdom, knowing it was a royal decree. So Mordecai, he went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. So Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal garments of blue and white that was befitting of his new position. He also wore a large crown of gold and purple robe of fine linen. And this verse closes with the statement that the city of Shushan had a joyous celebration. Now, I find this strange. I find it strange that the Persian residents of Shushan would rejoice at the decree that could be used against them. Verse 16. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor, and in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. When the edict became known throughout the province, there was great joy among the Jewish people, accompanied by feasting and other celebrations. And it says here that people of other nationalities became Jews out of fear of what the Jews might do to them. The statement that they became Jews might mean that they pretended to be Jews or took the side of Jews. We're not really sure, but the tables had turned completely that it was not dangerous to be a Jew. Let us pray.